They forced me out right after my wife's funeral from the home I paid nearly $2 million to build. My daughter and her husband claimed it was theirs now. I sat alone, drowning in betrayal, until I unlocked my wife's keepsake box. Inside was her last gift, not comfort, not peace, but the truth. And that truth will shatter their lives forever. You won't believe what happened next. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from in the comments. I sat in the silence of my living room, a silence so heavy it felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. The betrayal still echoed in my ears. My daughter and her husband had looked me straight in the eye and told me to leave the very house I built, the same house that once held every memory of love I had with my late wife, Maggie. Their words cut deeper than any knife, and in that hollow quiet, I found myself drifting back through the years, remembering all I had given them, everything I had sacrificed. I remembered writing those first tuition checks, my hands trembling, but my heart proud. 4 years at a private university for Jennifer had cost me close to $150,000, money I worked double shifts to save. I gave it gladly, telling myself I was buying her future. When she wanted a wedding that looked like it belonged in a magazine, I wrote another check, $40,000, for flowers, dresses, a ballroom big enough for 200 guests. And when she and Brian wanted to buy their first home, I pulled $100,000 out of my retirement to cover the down payment. I told myself this was what fathers do. This was love in action. But love, I see now, had turned into a blank check they cashed without a second thought. It wasn't just money. It was years of saying no to myself so I could say yes to them. I skipped vacations with Maggie, telling her maybe next year when things settled down. I drove a car so old the paint peeled and the heater barely worked, while Brian flaunted a shiny new SUV. There were nights when Maggie and I ate beans and rice at the kitchen table, not because we couldn't afford better, but because I wanted to put aside every dollar I could for Jennifer's comfort. And I told myself it was worth it. Every canceled plan, every missed opportunity, every ache in my body after working overtime. Worth it because my daughter would never have to struggle the way I did. Now, sitting alone in the house I once thought of as our sanctuary, I realized how blind I had been. I had given and given until there was nothing left of me but bones and breath. And the thanks I got was being shoved out of my own front door. The house loomed around me like a ghost of better times. 2 stories of wood and brick on Fairmount Hill, worth nearly $600,000 now, but to me, its value was beyond money. Maggie and I had laid the first tile ourselves. I could still see her on her knees in the kitchen, hair tied back, laughing as grout smeared across her cheek. We built this place with love and sweat, with every board nailed down like a promise. The staircase still creaked on the 3rd step. Jennifer used to sneak down it as a child, thinking she was quiet, but Maggie and I always knew. The photographs on the wall showed Christmas mornings, birthdays, Sunday dinners. Every inch of this house carried our story. And now it was the weapon my own child used to hurt me, to humiliate me. I looked at the family portrait hanging above the fireplace. Maggie was smiling, her arm around me, Jennifer standing in front, still innocent, still mine. I had always thought that picture would bring me comfort. Now it mocked me. That smile was gone forever, buried in the ground, and the child we raised had turned her back on everything we taught her. The room, once filled with laughter, was silent, except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner. Each tick felt like a countdown, a reminder that time was running out, that the life I thought I knew was already gone. As I walked through the hall, my eyes fell on Maggie's old cedar chest, the one she had kept at the foot of our bed. I hadn't touched it since she died. My hands hesitated on the lid, but something inside me said, "Open it." Inside lay folded quilts, photographs, a few letters tied with ribbon, and then I saw it, A smaller wooden box, one I didn't recognize. It was heavy, locked with a simple clasp. My heart pounded as I opened it. Inside, wrapped in yellowed paper, was a letter in Maggie's handwriting. My throat tightened as I unfolded it. The words on the page shook me. Maggie had written about Brian, warning me that she had discovered things he tried to hide. Gambling debts, loans taken out in my name, papers he had forged, trying to shift ownership of the house without me knowing. She had confronted him once, quietly, hoping to keep the peace for Jennifer's sake. But she wrote that if anything ever happened to her, I needed to know the truth. My hands trembled as I read on. There was even a copy of a legal document, one Brian had doctored, tucked inside the envelope. My stomach turned cold. It was like being stabbed twice in the same wound. Betrayed by my daughter, and now learning that Maggie had carried this secret alone to protect me. I felt grief all over again, heavier than the first time. She must have been so afraid, so burdened, yet she never told me. I pressed the letter to my chest and whispered into the emptiness, "Maggie, why didn't you tell me?" The walls gave no answer, only the echo of my own pain. But beneath the grief, something else stirred. This was not just a letter. It was a weapon. It was Maggie's last gift to me, not comfort, but the truth, and truth had power. Truth could tear apart the lies Brian had built his life on. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something other than despair. I felt the fire of resolve. I sat there for hours, staring at that letter, reading it again and again, memorizing every word. My mind shifted from shock to clarity. They thought they had stripped me of everything, but they had underestimated Maggie. She had seen further than any of us. She had left behind the key to unraveling Brian's entire scheme. I whispered again, softer this time. "Thank you, Maggie. You knew I'd need this, and I won't waste it." The phone buzzed on the table, another string of messages from Jennifer. Apologies mixed with demands, excuses tangled with pleas. My thumb hovered over the screen. For a moment, the old part of me, the part that still wanted to believe she could be my little girl again, ached to answer. But then I looked back at the letter. I looked at the walls around me, now scarred with betrayal. And I made a choice. I opened the messages one by one and deleted them. Not a single word back. My silence was my answer. For the first time in years, I chose myself. It felt like ripping off a bandage that had festered too long, painful but freeing. The weight on my chest lifted just a little. The room around me seemed different. The armchair I used to sink into with Maggie felt too big, swallowing me whole. The grandfather clock, once a gentle rhythm in our evenings, now ticked like a judge's gavel. Every sound, every shadow reminded me that this home was no longer the safe place it had been. It was a battlefield, and the battle had already begun. I stood in front of Maggie's photograph on the mantel. Her eyes seemed to watch me, steady and kind. I whispered to her, my voice breaking but strong. "Maggie, I will protect what we built. I will defend our name, our house, our legacy. They will not destroy what we created together." The words echoed in the stillness, and I felt something shift inside me. The man who had been broken by betrayal was gone. In his place stood someone ready to fight, ready to use every ounce of truth, every scrap of evidence to bring justice. My pain had forged resolve. My grief had become fire. And as I folded Maggie's letter back into its box, I knew this was only the beginning. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment 1 below to let me know you're here with me. The morning after I found Maggie's letter, I woke up with a different kind of weight pressing on my chest. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was something sharper, something alive. For weeks I had been stumbling around in the dark, broken by betrayal, but now I had a candle in my hand. Maggie's words had lit it, and I wasn't going to let it burn out. The first thing I did was pick up the phone and call the bank. My hands no longer shook the way they had the day Jennifer and Brian stood in my living room and told me to leave. No, this time they were steady. My voice was steady, too, when I spoke to the woman on the other end. "This is Edward Walker. I need to freeze all automatic payments linked to my account." I heard my own words with a kind of astonishment. They were strong, firm. For the first time in months, maybe years, I was the one in control. I canceled the auto payments Brian had set up under my name, the $300 mortgage, the $400 insurance on their SUV, the $500 grocery card that magically paid their bills while I ate alone at my kitchen table. I even canceled the supplemental credit card they had been using, one they promised was just for emergencies. Funny how emergencies always seem to look like luxury handbags, golf clubs, and weekend trips to Atlantic City. As I signed the electronic forms to revoke access, I noticed my hand. It wasn't trembling. It moved with certainty across the page. That felt like a revelation. When I finished, the banker on the other end paused. Her name was Lucy. I could see it on the screen of my laptop from our video call. She had kind eyes, even through the grainy resolution. She said softly, "You're doing the right thing, Mr. Walker." Those words hit me harder than I expected. A stranger, someone who had no obligation to me, showed more care in a single sentence than my daughter had in years. I felt my throat tighten. I swallowed hard, managed a nod, and thanked her. The contrast nearly broke me, but instead it made my spine a little straighter. Later that day, I called my insurance company. "Cancel the vehicle coverage," I told them. "The car's not mine. It belongs to my son-in-law. Take it off my policy." My voice didn't waver. Then I called the credit card company and demanded that every charge be flagged, every line they had attached to me be severed. Each call was like cutting a rope they had wrapped around my neck. With every snip, I could breathe a little easier. I kept Maggie's letter on the table beside me the whole time, as if her presence in those words was guiding me through each step. I could almost hear her voice. "Steady, Ed. Don't let them break you." And I didn't. That evening, my phone lit up with calls from Jennifer, one after another. First her number, then Brian's, then unknown numbers I knew had to be them using someone else's phone. I didn't answer. I let the voicemails pile up. My silence became my shield. For the first time, I wasn't chasing their approval. I wasn't begging for scraps of affection. I was protecting what was mine. The next morning, I sat at my old oak desk, opened a fresh folder, and wrote across the top, "Brian Dossier." Inside, I began recording every detail Maggie had left me and everything I was now uncovering. The gambling debts she'd mentioned, the forged documents, the strange withdrawals from my savings account. I even wrote down the names of the casinos I found on old bank statements, the dates and amounts, line by line. $200 at Atlantic City, $3,700 at Mohegan Sun, $1,800 at some shady online betting site. The numbers stared back at me like an accusation. I felt no fear as I wrote, only clarity. This was evidence. This was the rope he had wrapped around himself, and I was just holding the other end. I printed the copies of Maggie's letter, slid one into the folder, and locked it in my filing cabinet. For the first time, the playing field was tilting back in my direction. 2 days later, I decided to meet with my lawyer, Mr. Harlan. I carried the folder under my arm like a weapon. His office was on the second floor of a brick building downtown, the kind with creaky stairs and the faint smell of coffee drifting from the cafe below. When I walked in, his assistant looked up with polite surprise. "Mr. Walker, good to see you. Do you have an appointment?" I shook my head. "Not today, but I think he'll want to see me." She must have seen something in my face, because she ushered me right in. Harlan was a stocky man in his 70s, with sharp eyes behind rimless glasses. He listened quietly as I laid the folder on his desk. and told him everything. When I finished, he leaned back and exhaled. "Ed, you've been more patient than most men would be. But you're right. It's time to fight back." He flipped through the papers, nodding. "This letter, this is dynamite. And the forged documents? If this is verified, Brian could be in very serious trouble. Criminal trouble." I felt a strange calm settle over me as he spoke. Fear was gone, replaced by a quiet resolve. My voice didn't crack when I answered him. "Then let's make sure it's verified." He smiled grimly. "We'll start with freezing access, transferring certain assets into a protected trust. You'll need to sign some papers." He slid them across the desk. My pen moved smoothly, my hand firm. I noticed it again. No tremor, no hesitation. Signing my name felt like reclaiming a part of myself I thought I'd lost forever. As I left, the assistant touched my arm. "Are you okay, Mr. Walker? Do you need help getting downstairs?" Her concern startled me. Simple, genuine kindness from a young woman who had no stake in my life. It contrasted so painfully with Jennifer's coldness that I nearly broke down right there. Instead, I patted her hand and said, "I'm fine, but thank you." And I meant it. That night, Jennifer called again. I answered this time, not because I wanted to hear her excuses, but because I wanted to hear her lies with new ears. Her voice was sugar at first. "Dad, we just wanted to talk. Brian says you must have misunderstood. We were just trying to manage things for you, make life easier." I didn't interrupt. I let her talk. Then Brian's voice came on, brash and confident. "Ed, you can't handle these accounts yourself. Look at the bills. The mortgage, the insurance, the groceries. It's all too much for you. We've got the spreadsheets right here. We're keeping it under control." I stayed silent. Let them talk themselves deeper. He rattled off numbers like trophies. $1,300 mortgage, $400 insurance, $500 groceries, all of it covered by me, like I should be grateful. My silence unnerved him. I could hear it in the pause, the slight hitch in his voice. Then he tried another tactic. "Remember that letter you wrote us years ago, Ed? About wanting us to take over the house someday? Well, that's all we're doing. Honoring your wishes." I nearly laughed. They were digging up scraps of the past, twisting them into weapons. But I saw the desperation under it. They had to reach that far back just to justify their greed. In that moment, I thought, they're already losing. I ended the call without a word. My silence was more powerful than shouting ever could be. The following week, a new twist came. My neighbor, Mrs. Fletcher, stopped me on the sidewalk. She was in her 80s, sharp as a tack despite her age. She leaned close and whispered, "I saw Brian talking to two men near your driveway. They had clipboards, looked like real estate folks. He was pointing at your house, laughing, calling you an old man who can't tell left from right." My stomach turned to ice. The rage that surged through me was almost blinding. They weren't just plotting to steal. They were already trying to sell, erasing me from my own life like I was nothing but dust. I clenched my fists, forced myself to breathe. "Thank you, Mrs. Fletcher," I said quietly. My voice was calm, but inside, a storm was raging. To be called forgetful, senile, by the man whose bills I had been paying for years, it was almost too much to bear. I walked back inside and stared at Maggie's photo. My chest heaved. "They think I'm finished," I whispered, "but they don't know what's coming." That night, Amanda, my daughter, called in a panic. Her voice was shrill. "Dad, what have you done? The bank says our cards are declined, the mortgage bounced, and the insurance lapsed. What did you do?" I listened, letting her desperation pour through the phone. Then Brian grabbed it, his voice low and venomous. "You think you can play games, old man? You'll regret this." I hung up, just like that. No answer, no argument. The silence was my shield, and it drove them mad. In the quiet afterward, I sat in my armchair, the dossier open on my lap, Maggie's letter tucked inside. My breathing slowed, my pulse steadied. For the first time, I realized I wasn't the victim anymore. I was holding the cards. They thought they had cornered me, but all they'd done was push me into a place where I could finally see the board clearly. I leaned forward, whispered into the dark. They think I've lost, but the game has only just begun. And as I whispered those words, I knew Chapter 4 would not be about defense. It would be about an attack. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment below to let me know you're here with me. I set the dining room the way Maggie used to when company mattered. Fresh coffee, the good plates, soft lamplight instead of the harsh overhead. I opened the windows just enough for the late afternoon breeze on Fairmount Hill to move the curtains. The house smelled like lemon oil and old wood. I wanted the room to feel calm when the storm came. I placed chairs around the oak table, then left one end clear for my folder, the heavy one I'd labeled in black ink, Brian Dossier. On top of it, I set a single envelope from a cedar box upstairs, the one with Maggie's handwriting. I didn't look at it. I already knew every loop of every letter. By 5 o'clock, they started arriving. Jenny walked in first, eyes red, chin tight. She didn't meet my eyes. Behind her came Brian in that blue sport coat he loved, the one he wore when he wanted to look like a winner. His jaw worked like he was chewing a piece of anger. He offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ed," he said, as if we were business partners and not two men standing on opposite sides of a cliff. Behind them, the front door creaked again. Gary Mitchell stepped in, wiping his boots, hat in hand. He nodded to me, then to the others, the way a decent man does when he knows he isn't welcome, but refuses to show fear. Pastor Reynolds followed, tall, gentle, the sort of presence that makes people lower their voices without being told. Mrs. Fletcher came with Gary. She'd insisted. "I'm steady enough," she'd told me over the phone, "and they'll need to hear me say it. Plain." My lawyer, Harlan, arrived last, leather briefcase under his arm, his reading glasses hanging by a cord, like a judge who packed his own gavel. We sat. No one touched the coffee. I let the quiet settle. Let it make them impatient. Let it press on the throat. Outside, a neighbor's wind chimes made a thin music that sounded like nerves. Brian broke first. "Let's be efficient," he said, sliding a manila folder onto the table. "We've put a plan together to stabilize your situation." He glanced at Jenny, then at the pastor, as if collecting an audience. He laid out printouts with highlighted lines, a spreadsheet with my name plastered on monthly expenses like a brand, and one $300 mortgage, $400 insurance, $500 groceries, streaming services I didn't watch, memberships I never joined. He talked quickly, the way people do when they think speed is the same as authority. "You've been overwhelmed, Ed. We stepped in. You'll sign a transfer of responsibility tonight. We'll manage payments, sell the property at the right time, and make sure you're comfortable." I watched his hands. They moved like a card dealer. He didn't look at me when he said, "Sell the property." He looked at the window at his reflection. Jenny finally spoke. "Dad, please, this is best. You'll be safe. You can stay somewhere quieter, somewhere smaller." The word smaller landed like a pebble, but I felt the whole hillside slide underneath it. Smaller meant less of me. It meant papers with my name erased. It meant a room at the end of a hall. Gary cleared his throat. "Mr. Miller," he said in that plain Salem way, "you came to my shop 2 months ago, tried to talk me into saying I'd seen you sign papers with Tom. Papers you said gave you rights to this house. I told you I didn't lie for anyone. Not then. Not now." Brian's smile flickered. He didn't glance at Jenny. He didn't deny it. He picked up the spreadsheet and tapped the totals like a metronome, as if sound alone could drown out truth. Pastor Reynolds folded his hands. "Before we go further, I need to say something on my conscience." He looked at me, then at Jenny and Brian. "You came to me last week. You asked me to tell the congregation that Tom was losing his mind. You asked me to say it from the pulpit so people would stop listening to him." He let the words hang. The room went still. The wind chimes were suddenly loud. Jenny shifted in her chair. Brian sat very straight, the way men do when they're caught and try to make their spines stand in for integrity. The pastor's voice stayed soft. "I told you I would not, because it wasn't true, and because using God to back a lie doesn't make it a truth." Jenny's face flushed. "We were scared," she said to the pastor, then to me. "Dad, you were cutting things off without explaining." She swallowed. "We panicked." Her voice wavered on the last word. It might have moved me once. It didn't now. I remembered beans and rice. I remembered Maggie's letter. Mrs. Fletcher sat forward, small hands clasped around a pocketbook, older than the rest of us. "I may be 83, she said, "but I can see and hear just fine. I saw you, Mr. Miller, standing at the end of the driveway last Tuesday with two fellows holding clipboards. Heard you tell them Tom was an old man who didn't know what day it was. Heard you say this place would be on the market soon." She looked at me, then back at him. "I won't stand by and watch a neighbor get thrown out of his life." Harlan took a measured breath, then laid out documents like a dealer with a winning hand. He didn't need to rush. "To clarify the timeline," he said, "Mr. Walker contacted the bank last week. He froze all auto payments. He revoked supplementary credit cards used without his consent. He removed non-owned vehicles from his insurance. He placed his accounts into a protective trust. All actions taken by a competent individual, all legal, all final." He slid a copy of the trust across the table. "Signatures, dates, witnesses." Brian laughed once, a sharp bark with no humor. "Lawyers and their games," he said. "Meanwhile, the house is slipping into arrears. You think the bank cares about your little trust, Ed?" He tapped the spreadsheet again, harder. "We're the only ones keeping this on track." I placed my hand on the dossier. My fingers didn't shake. I could feel my pulse in the pad of my thumb, steady as a march. "No," I said quietly, the first word I'd offered since we sat down. "You kept yourselves on track, and you used my name to pave the road." I opened the dossier and pulled out the first stack. Not the loudest, not the deadliest, just enough to move the ground. "You told Jenny," I said, looking at Brian, "that you were helping me with bills. But here are withdrawals that went from my savings to Atlantic City, to Mohegan Sun, to a dozen online betting sites." I slid the pages across, trimmed and labeled, $5,200, $30 $700, $1,800, $2,450. "You called that help." I let him look. Let everyone look. Jenny's voice dropped to a whisper. "Brian, is that—" He didn't answer her. He set his jaw and reached for indignation, a coat that didn't fit him anymore. "This is out of context," he said. "Those were short-term transfers, investment movements. Ed doesn't understand." Gary snorted. "Son, if it looks like a slot machine and sounds like a slot machine, it ain't a mutual fund." I didn't smile. I pulled the next layer. "You said you were only protecting what I wanted. That letter you keep waving around from 8 years ago, the one where I said, in a moment of hope, that I wanted Jenny to always think of this as her home, wasn't a deed." Harlan slid a copy of my actual deed across the table. "Titles matter," he said, even-toned. "And this title has one name on it." Brian rolled his neck, his. "So what?" he muttered. "You're going to drag us through court over what should be ours anyway?" Now the mask slipped. Not stewardship, ownership. He'd said the word should. It sounded like a man laying claim to reign. I let the quiet fill again. I saw Pastor's eyes flick to the envelope beside my hand. I saw the way he nodded, like a man who knows a hymn's last verse before it's sung. But I didn't pick up the envelope yet. Not yet. You don't light your biggest fire first. Harlan cleared his throat. We also have communications, he said, emails and texts from Mr. Miller to third parties suggesting this house would be used as collateral for a private loan. We have a preliminary rejection letter from First Oregon Bank referencing a questionable application. We have the bank officer's affidavit. He set those down. That's attempted fraud at minimum. Brian's voice got louder, not stronger. Affidavits can be bought. People lie. He looked around for allies, found none. He stared at Jenny as if willing her to speak on cue. She didn't. She was staring at the words on the page, the numbers like nails in a plank. When she finally looked up, her eyes were big, the way a child's are when they realize the shadow at the end of the hall isn't a coat rack. Brian, she said softly, tell me you didn't do this. He snapped. We talked about this. You said you trusted me to handle it. You said your father was slipping. He jerked a thumb toward me. You told me to take charge. Jenny flinched like the words had weight. I never told you to steal, she whispered. The air in the room changed. The first fissure ran through their shared front like ice cracking on a lake. I picked up the envelope. My thumb brushed over Maggie's name. I heard her in the creak of the third stair, in the rhythm of the clock, in the way the light leaned across the table like a hand. I broke the seal and unfolded her letter. My voice was steady. I didn't read all of it. I didn't need to. I read enough. Ed, I read, if you are holding this, it means I didn't have the courage to tell you while I was alive. I found papers in Brian's things. He tried to shift the house by forging your name on a draft document. He told me it was a mistake. He asked me to forget it. I didn't. I made copies. I'm sorry I kept it from you. I wanted to protect you, and I wanted our daughter to wake up on her own. If I was wrong, forgive me. Use this if you must. I trust you to do the right thing. Love, Maggie. I set the letter down. The room breathed out and in again, like a chest after a long run. Harlan laid the copies next to it, the bank stamp, the rejected application, the signatures that were not mine, no matter how much they tried to look like it. He spoke like a man reading a weather report before a storm. Forgery, he said, fraud, and in combination with the statements we've collected, a pattern. Brian's face changed. It didn't break all at once. It sagged, then twisted, then hardened. She hated me, he said, nodding at Maggie's letter like it was a weapon someone had swung from beyond the grave. Your wife never wanted me in this family. She made you suspicious. She... Stop, I said quietly. I felt something like heat in my throat, but it wasn't rage. It was defense. It was the instinct of a man who will not let someone spit on a grave. You don't speak her name that way in this house. He leaned back, a sharp laugh in his nose. This house? This house? You're an old man clutching wood and paint like it's God. You should be thanking me for keeping it from falling apart. Keeping it, Gary murmured, from falling into your pocket. Pastor Reynolds looked at Jenny. Child, he said gently, because he still saw her as someone who could be reached. You can make a different choice in this moment. Jenny covered her mouth. Tears started, real ones now. Not the practiced kind. Not the kind meant to hurry along a signature. I didn't know, she said, but her voice had the small twist of truth all grown people hear when they know the ways they have looked away. I tapped the dossier once with my finger, not to make a sound, but to feel the wood, to feel that I was still anchoring something. I loved you, I said to my daughter. I still do, but love is not a credit card without a limit. I turned to Brian. And respect is not a loan you repay by stripping a man's name off his own door. He bared his teeth at the papers as if they could be scared. You don't have anything a judge will care about. He'll ask if you're competent. We'll show him your canceled payments and your mistakes. We'll show him your age. We'll show him letters where you said you wanted Jenny to have it all. You've trapped yourself, Ed. I took a deep breath. The kind you take when you've carried a burden up a hill and realize you can set it down and it will not roll back on you. No, I said. I turned to Harlan. He nodded, opened his briefcase, and removed a thin binder with blue cover and clean edges. He set it in front of me. I placed my hand on it, then slid it into the light so everyone could see. This, I said, is my new will, signed, witnessed, filed. I let the words pace themselves. The house is no longer going to either of you. It will be transferred to the Veterans Housing Trust to be used as transitional housing for families who served and are finding their feet again. I looked at Jenny when I said families. I looked at Brian when I said served. You two will not profit from what Maggie and I built. The room made its own sound then. A kind of hush that isn't quiet at all. Jenny's breath hitched. Brian's chair scraped hard enough to scar the floor. "You can't do that," he snapped. "You can't give away what's ours." "It was never yours," I said. I felt it in my bones, calm as gravity. You think ownership is a trick of paper. It isn't. Ownership is what you prove every day you live inside walls. It's how you treat the people whose names are on the photographs. Harlan added the practical blow. Legally, he said, it's already done in substance. The trust instruments were recorded. The will is in probate. Attempting to interfere now would only further expose you to civil and criminal liability. Brian swung to Jenny, panic showing through the anger now. "Say something," he hissed. "Tell him he can't cut you out. Tell him you'll contest." Jenny stared at the letter, at Maggie's hand. She shook her head like someone trying to clear water from her ears. "You said it was handled," she whispered. "You said those bank things were misunderstandings. You said Dad would be better off not worrying." She looked at me, and for a moment I saw my little girl, hair tangled from sleep, standing in a doorway, asking if the thunder would break the windows. "Dad," she said, "I'm sorry." Brian slammed his palm on the table. His coffee sloshed in cups no one had touched. "Don't talk to him," he barked. "He's playing you. He's always played you." "Enough," Pastor Reynolds said, not loud, but with the weight of someone who has spoken into storms before. "This is not a stage for your pride." Something in Brian broke then, not silently. He grabbed the spreadsheet and ripped it in half, then in half again, paper tearing like the sound of a bridge giving way. "You think you won," he spat at me. "You think giving away the house makes you noble. You think these people will take care of you when you can't remember your own name?" He gestured at Gary, at the pastor, at Mrs. Fletcher, at Harlan. "They'll be gone, and so will your money." Harlan remained seated, hands folded. "Your concern for Mr. Walker's memory is noted," he said dryly. "So is your complete lack of concern for his consent." Brian turned as if to leave, as if the room had become too small to hold his fury. At the doorway, he pivoted back and jabbed a finger at Jenny. "This is your fault," he said. "You never could control him. You don't know how to push the right buttons. I told you to make the pastor read that statement, and you couldn't even do that." Jenny's face crumpled. "Don't put this on me," she said, voice too loud for such a small person. "You promised me it was safe. You promised me you were fixing it. You swore to me you weren't gambling anymore." The words came faster, each one cutting a slice. "You swore." The last word fell flat and hard. He opened his mouth to bark back. Then he saw the officers in the hall. I had asked Harlan to arrange for the service of the restraining order at the end of our meeting. I didn't want a scene on the street. I wanted it witnessed in the house where the harm had started. The deputies stepped just inside, calm, practiced. "Mr. Miller," the taller one said, "we need you to stay while we serve a protective order and notify you of pending allegations." He handed over the papers as if they were just mail, as if paper couldn't weigh a life down. Brian laughed again, a sound with no oxygen. "You dragged the cops into a family issue," he sneered. "Congratulations." But his hand shook when he took the documents. He scanned the first page and lost color at the mention of forgery. He scanned the second and found the line about fraudulent application. He scanned the third and saw the bank officer's affidavit, Gary's statement, Mrs. Fletcher's, the pastor's note. He looked at Maggie's letter, and for a second, a flashing second, I thought he would tear it too. He didn't. He stared at it as people stare at a mirror when they don't recognize their face. I spoke again because I needed to say it out loud, not for him, not for the officers, but for myself. "I let you live under my roof," I said. "I paid your bills." I called that love. It wasn't love. It was fear dressed up as generosity. I was afraid of losing my daughter. I was afraid of disappointing my wife's memory. I let you turn my love into a leash. I took a breath. No more. The deputy nodded to me, then to Harlan. "We're done here for now," he said. "Mr. Miller, you'll be hearing from the district attorney." They stepped back into the hall. Brian stood there, small suddenly, like a man whose suit didn't fit anymore. He might have said something. If he did, no one listened. He put the papers under his arm and walked out, the way men walk out of a church when they don't want anyone to see their face. The house held still, the way houses do after an argument when the sound has to settle into the walls. Gary exhaled, a long, slow breath. "Well," he said, "that's one for Salem to talk about." Mrs. Fletcher reached for my hand and patted it, a warm, bird-soft rhythm that reminded me of my mother, in a kitchen long gone. Pastor Reynolds bowed his head for a moment, then looked straight at me. "You did right," he said. "Doing right isn't always clean, but it's right." I closed the dossier. I picked up Maggie's letter and folded it along the lines her hands had made. I pressed it to my chest because I needed to feel paper and ink become something like skin. Then I set it carefully in the envelope and put it away. Some truths you carry. Some you put back in the cedar box where they can watch over your sleep. Jenny didn't move for a long time. Then she stood a little unsteady and looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time in years. The photographs, the clock, the dent on the baseboard where she'd ridden a tricycle too fast and crashed into the wall, while Maggie laughed so hard she cried. "Dad," she said, voice small, "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "That's not how forgiveness works," I said. "You can't deserve it. You can only need it, and then you can try to live in a way that honors it." Tears slid down her face. She nodded, not because she understood, maybe, but because she wanted to. She reached for me, tentative, like a child reaching for a dog that used to bite. I opened my arms. She stepped in. Her shoulders shook against my chest. "I didn't promise anything. I didn't say we were fine. I just stood there, the way a lighthouse stands even when the ship is still far out." Harlan cleared his throat after a minute, bringing us back to the business of the aftermath. "We'll file the addendum to the trust in the morning," he said. "We'll notify the bank that the restraining order has been served. We'll secure the house's title against any further shenanigans." He looked at me. "Do you want to make the announcement to the group about the transfer, or shall I?" "I'll do it," I said. I stepped to the doorway and called for the neighbors who'd gathered on the lawn, people who had watched with worried eyes but stayed polite enough to keep their distance. They drifted in, a few at first, more as the word moved down the street. I stood where the hallway opens to the living room, so the family photographs framed the view, and Maggie's smile hovered over my shoulder the way it did in life. "This is still my home," I said to them, "and it will be until it becomes someone else's home for a better reason. I'm transferring this house to the Veterans Housing Trust." I saw the surprise, then something like approval pass across faces. Families who served will live here when they need a place to catch their breath. I swallowed because my throat was thick again. Maggie loved this town. She believed houses should be full of life, not fear. A sound rose. I'm not ashamed to call applause, not loud, not wild, honest. Hands from people who had painted each other's porches and shoveled each other's driveways in February. Gary clapped me on the shoulder. The pastor said a soft blessing no one needed to answer out loud. Mrs. Fletcher wiped at her eyes and said, "Good, good." It wasn't much as speeches go. It was everything as moments went by. When the last neighbor drifted back to their own kitchens, when the house finally exhaled the long breath it had been holding, I walked to the front door with Harlan. On the porch, he paused. "You know there will be pushback," he said. "Angry words, maybe ugly ones." I nodded. "I've lived long enough to know that angry words don't last like solid deeds do." He smiled, a small crooked thing that said he'd been waiting all afternoon for me to say something like that. "I'll see you in the morning," he said. He patted the briefcase where the will lay sleeping. "Sleep if you can." After he left, I stood in the doorway and listened to the evening. I could hear a television 2 houses down, a dog bark up the street, and a train far off where the river bends. The chimes on my porch moved like breath. Jenny was in the kitchen, rinsing cups no one had drunk from. The pastor sat at the table, finishing the cold coffee with the kind of politeness that keeps small towns stitched together. Gary walked Mrs. Fletcher home, step for step, like a son. I closed the door. The house felt different, not lighter exactly. Truer. The way a story feels when you stop skipping the hard parts. In the living room, I touched the third stair. It creaked, faithful as a friend. I looked up at Maggie's picture. "We did it," I said, because I needed to say we somewhere, now that another we had been cut loose. "We did what was right." Later, when the dishes were put away, and Jenny had gone home in silence, and the pastor had prayed in the doorway, and left me with a blessing I could feel in my shoulders, I sat in my old armchair. I laid my palm flat on the wood. The grain felt like a map. I thought about the courtroom still to come, about depositions and signatures and hard chairs and the way fluorescent lights make everyone look tired. I thought about Brian's face when the deputies handed him the order. How bravado drains faster than color. I knew Chapter 5 would be about quiet if I was lucky, and work if I was honest, about how to live with a daughter who had betrayed me and then turned back toward the light, about how to live without the house when the day came to hand over the keys, about making the cabin by the lake feel like a home and not a retreat, about being an old man who was not done yet. Before I turned out the lamp, I spoke to Maggie one more time, not in my head, but into the room, because saying things out loud makes them stand in the air where you can face them. "They thought I was weak," I said softly, "but now they see consequences." It wasn't a threat. It was a fact, a cold, clean one, like the first star on a winter evening. And to you, listening to this, to anyone who has been told they are less than, who has been pushed from the table they built, I will say this. Feeling dismissed hurts. Feeling invisible hurts. Feeling used hurts in a way that lives in your bones. If you know that pain, I know it with you. If you believe every person deserves respect, write one word in the comments. Respect. Now watch what happens when we stop whispering and start telling the truth out loud. If you're still watching and find this story interesting, please comment 3 below to let me know you're here with me. I remember the feeling that morning when I signed the final stack of papers. The judgment was official. Brian had been sentenced to 4 years in prison for fraud and threatening me with a weapon. I didn't have to sit in the courtroom to hear the judge read it out loud, but I chose to. I sat in the back row, listened to the gavel strike, watched Brian drop his head, and saw Jenny bury her face in her hands, sobbing. Her tears didn't change anything. They were simply the last chapter of choices that could no longer be undone. Jenny filed for divorce right after the sentencing. My lawyer told me, and though he spoke in his usual even tone, the picture of my daughter, my own flesh and blood, reduced to a shell of herself in court, made me ache and sigh with relief at the same time. Ache because of blood ties. Relief because truth had finally prevailed. I wasted no time with the house on Fairmount Hill. It had become a battlefield, scarred with betrayal. I decided to sell it. The final price was $600,000. When the buyers signed their names, I felt no regret. I felt like I had just set down a massive stone that had been pressing on my chest for years. I used part of that money to buy a cabin on Detroit Lake. Just 2 bedrooms, a small deck facing the water, but for me it was a beginning. I brought only what truly mattered: my father's old pocket watch, a stack of books I loved, and our wedding photo of Maggie in a sturdy oak frame. On the first morning in that cabin, I stepped onto the porch and stared at the glassy lake. No stolen withdrawals, no shouting matches, no schemes whispered behind closed doors. Just silence, just pine in the air. For the first time in months, I smiled without effort, and I whispered, "Maggie, I kept my promise." I began volunteering with a local veterans foundation. They ran housing programs for families who had served this country but had nowhere to go. I saw myself in them, men who gave more than they got, but still stood tall. I painted walls, swept porches, carried boxes, and listened to stories of old soldiers who once slept in foxholes but now slept in rusted trucks. Helping them didn't just bring me peace. It turned my own wounds into something useful. From the proceeds of the house, I donated $100,000 to a local scholarship fund. I asked them to name it after Maggie, so her kindness would live on. When I signed the check, my hand was steady. For the first time in years, I signed financial papers without feeling tricked or drained. I only felt proud. As for Brian, prison would give him plenty of time to reckon with himself. Jenny rented a small apartment far from town, trying to piece together some kind of life. She wrote me a letter once, an apology. She admitted she had been blind, that she had ignored what was in front of her. I read it, I folded it, I put it in a drawer. I didn't respond. I no longer needed their apologies. Forgiveness wasn't about hearing their words. Forgiveness was my choice, not to let bitterness live inside me. I whispered to myself, I don't need them anymore. I have myself. Mornings at the cabin became my treasure. I brewed coffee, stepped outside, and watched sunlight spill across the lake. I read, I fished, I planted Maggie's favorite flowers in the garden. Neighbors sometimes invited me over for cookouts. Kids from down the road ran up with wildflowers in their fists. I accepted each one like a gift, smiling, warmed in ways I thought I'd forgotten. The world still had kindness in it. I had only needed to step away from poison to see it. For me, this chapter ended with 3 lessons. To parents, love must come with boundaries. Unconditional sacrifice without wisdom doesn't buy gratitude. It feeds greed. To children, greed and disrespect will strip you of everything, even the purest gift of your parents' love. And about human nature in this modern world, money may buy comfort, but only truth and character will hold a family together. I lived lighter than I ever had. Each day was proof I had chosen rightly, that I had defended myself and honored the life Maggie and I had built. No more chains of betrayal, no more weight of manipulation. I was free. One autumn afternoon, with red leaves blanketing the road to the lake, I was invited to join the local senior council. They wanted me to help older folks avoid falling prey to the kind of exploitation I had faced. I said yes without hesitation. My story wasn't over. I would use what I had learned to guard others, to turn pain into strength. Looking back, I don't see regret anymore. I see gratitude for the chance to step forward, to start again. The cabin, the rippling lake, the laughter of children nearby, all of it whispered to me, I chose right. I whispered back to Maggie, to myself, to anyone listening. Character is the one treasure no one can ever take. And if you have ever felt betrayed by those closest to you, if you've ever felt trampled by the people who should have cherished you, I want you to pause and reflect. Comment on the lesson that touched you most, so I'll know this story reached your heart, and so together we can pass on respect, gratitude, and truth from one generation to the next. The story has come to an end. I hope it has brought you valuable lessons and insights. If you enjoyed this content, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next video. Goodbye, and see you again.